Welcome to today's webinar, Weaving Indigenous Wellbeing, Research and Ethics, Community and Campus Perspectives in Canada. My name is Michelle Pigeon, and I'm going to be your moderator for the webinar. I'm of Mi'kmaq ancestry from Newfoundland and Labrador, and I'm currently an associate professor here in the Faculty of Education at Simon Fraser University and director of the Center of Educational Leadership and Policy Studies. As a researcher, I'm interested in Indigenous student retention and recruitment, and also interested in Indigenous ethics and research methodologies as we work to empower our communities. We have three presenters with us today. Jennifer Rankin. Jennifer is an Ojibwe from the Patash First Nation. She's been working with the National Association of Friendship Centers for the past 5 years, and her current role is engaging the Administration of Urban Programming for Indigenous Peoples Program, which provides core funding to the NAFC, provincial and territorial associations and friendship centers across the country. We also have co-presenting with her, Shadi Hafez. Shadi is Algonquin, Anishinaabe, and Syrian from the Kitigan, Zibi, Anishinaabe, and currently the research advisor at the National Association of Friendship Centers. Part of this role includes coordinating the Urban Aboriginal Knowledge Network, my apologies. And then thirdly, we have Michelle Johnson-Jennings, who's joining us. She's Choctaw enrolled tribal member and is an Indigenous health psychologist, Canadian research chair for the Indigenous Community Engaged Research nominee, and an associate professor at the University of Saskatchewan in Indigenous Studies, and associated with the College of Medicine and Community Health and Engineering, or Epidemiology. I don't know how I got engineering out of that, sorry folks. Okay, Dr. Johnson-Jennings' therapeutic expertise lies in working with Indigenous communities and cross-cultural psychology. So thank you all for being our guest participants, and I really look forward to the conversation and the knowledge that you'll be sharing with us today. We'll begin the webinar with a few short presentations from our presenters, and then we'll move to a question and answer period. If any point those listening have a question, please submit it through the chat box, and we'll do our best to moderate conversations and discussions during the Q&A. Okay, so Jennifer, why don't you get us started?
Okay, so we're actually going to start with the joint presentation with Shadi and I.
I'm Shadi Hafez, as mentioned earlier, and Jennifer Rankin. And our presentation is going to be called Research for a Better Life. So it's the National Association of Friendship Centers approach to urban Indigenous research. So before we begin, I think it's important that we give some quick kind of facts and notes about what the urban Indigenous population in Canada looks like. So according to the 2016 census, more than 1,022,000 or 61.1% of Indigenous people in Canada lived in a Canadian city or an urban center. Among those, Indigenous youth, so including urban Indigenous youth, are the fastest growing population in Canada. Urban Indigenous peoples generally fare better than on-reserve First Nations or Northern Inuit peoples, but their socioeconomic status remains lower than that of their non-Indigenous neighbors. And many of today's Indigenous peoples who migrate to urban centers from reserves do so for reasons such as employment, education, or improved quality of life. While some Indigenous peoples have actually known city life for more than 2, 3, or even 4 generations, so they've been here for quite a long time. So what does that have to do with us, and who are we as the National Association of Friendship Centers? So the NAFC was established in 1972, and we're a network of 106 friendship centers and 6 provincial and territorial associations from coast to coast. As the national body of the Friendship Center movement, the NAFC is democratically governed and accountable to its membership. The NAFC's mission is to improve the quality of life for Indigenous peoples in an urban environment by supporting self-determined activities which encourage equal access to and participation in Canadian society, and which respect and strengthen the increasing emphasis on Indigenous cultural distinctiveness. Friendship centers themselves emerged around 60 years ago when Indigenous people living in the city saw a need for a place for fellow Indigenous people to go for support in navigating mainstream systems and adjusting to their new surroundings. These first centers did not offer much in the way of formal services, but rather they helped form a sense of community and belonging that was vital to the successful transition of individuals and families who had made their way to the city in search of a better life. Currently, Friendship Centers have over 2,700 staff working across the country, making Friendship Centers one of the largest employers of Canada's urban Indigenous population. The current physical infrastructure of Friendship Centers looks at about 238 buildings and communities in cities from coast to coast to coast. The Friendship Centers offer programs and services to all urban Indigenous people, and we are regardless of status, so we're a status blind organization, and we offer services in areas such as housing, childcare, health, education, employment, culture and language, family and economic and community development and justice, and all wraparound services that are crucial for poverty reduction. Yes.
So Friendship Centers and urban Indigenous organizations have been using research to leverage funds in their community for different partnerships and different programming that occurs at the community level. And all of the goal of the research that we've been working on is to improve their quality of life, so research for a better life. One of the things that NAFC wanted to create to support community-driven research and that work is develop the NAFC research framework. So this is going to come in different parts with the development of our own research ethics. We've created an internal research policy, a research screening tool, a broader research policy statement, and then we're in the process of developing our own research ethics board at NAFC. So that will include members of our Senate, some of our youth council, and membership from across the country. And it will serve as a tool that we can use at the national office to, when we get requests for different research grants that come in and how it fits into community-driven research, and then also to support our provincial territorial associations and friendship centers to be able to navigate if the research is going to benefit it's going to benefit their community, and if it fits into their strategic plans. So a lot of the work that we've done with the research screening tool has been supported by the Pathways Engagement for Knowledge Exchange. This is funded through the Canadian Institutes of Health Research. And the main goals of this project has been to support communities to ethically and meaningfully engage in community-driven research by building and supporting community capacity to partner in pathways research, building capacity of community to turn research into action by supporting the development, implementation of community-specific knowledge and mobilization plans, building research capacity to understand and respect the urban Aboriginal research environment, and brokering and supporting research relationships between friendship centers and the implementation research teams, promoting urban Indigenous research opportunities among post-secondary institutes, and that's also a larger goal of the Urban Aboriginal Knowledge Network, and supporting and facilitating the scale-up of interventions. We're in the process right now, Shadi and also our colleague Carrie, in finalizing the research screening tool. And once the items are available, we'll be posting it on the NAFC website. And we're also looking into developing a microsite where we'll be posting the different sections of the research framework and also the screening tool and different training modules to help engage community members in research. Thank you.
So I'm going to now be discussing the UAKN, or known as the Urban Aboriginal Knowledge Network. So the UAKN is a research network of urban Indigenous communities, policymakers, and academics who engage together in community-driven research with the goal of contributing to a better quality of life for urban Indigenous people. There are 4 research centers across Canada. So there's one the Western Research Center out in BC. There's the Prairie Research Center in Saskatchewan. There's the Central, located at Trent in Ontario, and there's the Atlantic Regional Research Center. The UAKN is a community-driven research network with a focus on urban Indigenous concerns. And as mentioned, our goal is to contribute to a better quality of life for urban Indigenous peoples living in cities and towns by filling the current knowledge gap in urban Indigenous research, programming, and public policy. The UAKN establishes a national interdisciplinary network involving universities, community, and government partners for research, scholarship, and knowledge mobilization. The UACAN's national network provides a different kind of partnership by developing stronger relationships through a community-driven process. Our governance brings together urban Indigenous communities, academics, governments, and other stakeholders in pursuit of knowledge creation, mobilization, and transfer. The UACN has grown to include over 80 formal partners with over 53 regional research projects funded. That's actually an outdated number. We have significant higher number that I believe it's over 80 research projects funded now. And the 80 formal partners includes colleges, universities, friendship centers, different Indigenous organizations located in cities that are all partnering to do this research together. A priority area of the UAKN is to ensure training of new and emerging scholars, especially Indigenous scholars. To date, 30 graduate and undergraduate students have been involved in various capacities. The UAKN also supports communities as they build their own research capacity through this process. And we look forward to more opportunities to expand our network. The overarching goal of the UAKN is to develop progressive and positive public policy based on the research information collected by the community for the community. And essentially, the UACN has 4 sets of expertise, which are community-driven research, knowledge mobilization, administration and development of research networks and grant processes, and knowledge of local community structures. At the community level, friendship centers and other urban Aboriginal organizations play a critical role in our research development and policy improvement process. These organizations have effectively worked to ease social dislocation, assist with separation from family, and counter racial discrimination experienced by First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people. So just a little background of the UAKN. It's like as mentioned earlier, it's a multilateral partnership between urban Indigenous community, academia, and government. Since 2007, the partnership development has been led by the NAFC and Indigenous and Northern Development Canada. It operates through a shared partnership grant, which was $2.5 million over 5 years. And in 2016, we have 80 formal community, academic, government partners with expectations to add more partners in the coming years. This secretariat itself is located here at the NAFC, but is not exclusively for friendship centers. We have a variety of community partners as well. So as mentioned earlier, some of the big highlights that we have is that we've funded over 80 regional research projects, and we're still continuing to receive final projects from our regional centers. We have over 60 students involved to date, and as mentioned earlier, our partnership number was a little outdated, but we have over 80 verified partners, including co-applicants, collaborators, and various partners. So we're just going to highlight now some of the research projects that have come out of the UAKN to show some of the amazing work that is coming out of this kind of community-driven research process. So this is What I Wish You Knew, came out of the UAKN Atlantic Regional Center, and this was a project out of there. It was a community arts project led by the Mi'kmaq Native Friendship Center that brought together 50 Indigenous community members to explore what it means to be Indigenous and living in Halifax. These youths, adults, seniors, and elders each created a clay tile that depicts who they are as an Indigenous person and that tells the stories they wish others knew about what it means to be Indigenous and living in the city. This is What I Wish You Knew aimed at increasing the visibility of urban Indigenous peoples in Halifax and was driven by the sorry, I'm lost here. It is driven by the linked goals of urban Indigenous peoples in Halifax. So yeah, basically this project aimed to have urban Indigenous peoples express what it means to be urban and Indigenous through artwork. So what all the participants in this project produced video clips to share thoughts about their identities. And these video clips were actually collected on a website called thisiswhatIwishyouknew.com. So all the different clips from the various participants can be viewed there, as well as their the artwork that they created. So we'll go to the next slide. I'm just going to highlight some of the other UAKN projects. So this was a legacy project, which came out of the Prairie Regional Center, which was authentic engagement of First Nations and Métis traditional knowledge keepers. So 31 traditional knowledge keepers from across the province of Saskatchewan were approached in their own communities to contribute to the development of this guide to authentic engagement of traditional knowledge keepers. The aim was to provide insight into the appropriate protocols to follow when individuals, partners, and agencies are seeking the knowledge, wisdom, and advice of traditional knowledge keepers. So the traditional knowledge keepers were identified by their own communities to participate in this provincial engagement. So the communities themselves identified individuals who they felt had the right and the responsibility to speak to this, and those individuals were then brought together in this conference committee and contributed to this guide that can now be utilized in Saskatchewan in terms of how to engage those individuals. So the last one I'm going to talk about is examining a community-based theatre program as a source of resilience and well-being amongst Indigenous youth in Saskatchewan. So this was another prairie project that came out of the UAKN Prairie Regional Centre. So there is extensive data detailing the health inequities experienced by Canadian Indigenous populations. The goal of this research was to move beyond descriptions of Indigenous health inequities towards examinations of a community-based theatre program and its impacts on the resilience and well-being of Indigenous youth in an urban context. The primary research questions of this project that were identified through community consultations involved how can community-based theatre programs facilitate processes of resilience and well-being among Indigenous youth in urban Canadian contexts? How can community-based theatre programs facilitate decolonization and empowerment at embodied levels of youth experience? And how can traditional Indigenous forms of culture be integrated into arts-based theatre programs that support resilience and well-being outcomes for Indigenous youth in urban contexts? So this project basically examined this theatre program in Saskatchewan to see its effects on the urban Indigenous youth in Saskatoon. All these projects and all the UAKN projects can be viewed at uakn.org. So if you go there, at the top of the website, you can see, you can click on research, and that will bring you to all the various research projects. There's a little map that you can click on the various locations and see all the different projects that the UAKN has funded and the partnerships that exist as well. So moving forward, the NAFC has been granted institutional eligibility to hold funds for the next SHIRK grant. We hope to continue with a community-driven and led approach. We hope to further support and build research capacity in friendship centers and in urban Indigenous communities. We're not about excluding academic and government partners, but rather looking to develop enhanced partnerships between those communities and researchers, whether they be from academia or from government. We're looking for partners and letters of support for the renewal stage. So if you have any questions, feel free to email myself or Jennifer. Our emails are located there on the slide. And thank you for your time.
Thank you.
Great, thanks you both. That was really informative. I have just one quick question maybe. Thinking about what are some of the lessons that you've learned as a national organization whose really, mandate is to put communities first. I really appreciate it, for community, by the community. What are some lessons you've learned in doing that work?
I have one of the biggest lessons I think I've learned through navigating the space of community-driven research and academic and government and how all that partnership works. I've been approached a lot of times if I go speak somewhere, and we'll get kind of questions like, well, I approached the community and they said no, so what do I do now? And sometimes I think the simple message that it might just stop there is kind of a groundbreaking idea. And it's not always about going around trying to find someone that's just going to say yes and speak in behalf of the community, that you really need to listen. And if it's not aligned with the community needs, then it probably won't move forward. And I think that's a big lesson learned.
Great. And can you just maybe elaborate a little bit more about the research capacity building that you're undertaking with particularly, youth community members and Indigenous students?
So I think one of the big things that we've worked with friendship centers is a lot of them don't think that they're engaging in research, but in fact, a lot of them are engaging in research every day through the programs and services that they provide, through the proposals and the funding that we're receiving. So giving them the capacity and the strength to actually manage and run their own research priorities and how to navigate. And sometimes they might still want to get an academic to come and work with them on behalf of the community, but it starts really with relationship building and giving them the tools that they need to actually have those healthy and supportive relationships that are based on respect for mutual benefit. And it's okay also some messaging that if the academic is going to benefit from the relationship as well, like for things that they're pursuing, but being upfront from the beginning what your intentions are so everybody knows what's happening at the table.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's really great insight. And I think that's a really good transition point to invite Michelle now to share her wisdom with us.
Okay, so halito, so Jeffrey Michelle Johnson Jennings, mi jahaini inki hokupona, chapter sia hoke, satik pakyat aba oma ayatok. So very nice to be here today. Thank you very much for inviting me to speak. I just want to acknowledge the land that I'm sitting upon currently and the ancestors of this land, as well as acknowledging that everyone's joining from all around and with the ancestors that are there as well. And part of the reason we do this isn't just verbiage, but from my cultural perspective, I am taught to acknowledge my ancestors that I bring into any type of conversation or group, as well as the ancestors of those who are joining in as well. So thank you for that. I am Choctaw, so I am not from Canada, although as Choctaw, we didn't see the border originally, of course, and we do have stories of traveling up and down the river systems from here to there. My Choctaw people hail from the southeastern portion of the U.S. My ancestors in particular came from Alabama, which is nowadays referred to as Alabama. So a little bit of a distortion there. But they were removed from Alabama into Oklahoma through the Trail of Tears. And I just have up on the screen some images of who I am. I do come from our mountains in Oklahoma, so used to a little bit more trees than on the prairie. And from a long line of very strong, powerful Choctaw Hoyo or women, with myself pictured with my Pokney, my grandmother there. I am from the Oklahanali clan, or the Six Town clan, and I'm a clinical health psychologist by training, and I focus on land-based healing. I don't have a lot of time, I know today, but I wanted to just briefly summarize a story that we have. And for Choctaw people, we have a very important link to Inholiktopa Ishki, which is our Mother Earth. And a long time ago, the Choctaws actually lived in darkness. And it was there that we lived and we were languishing, we weren't flourishing. And Fala, the raven, came to tell us of a different land in which we could cross. And so the Choctaw people gathered up their ancestors' bones, but first they had to wait for the 7 grandmothers to decide whether or not they would leave. And the grandmothers prayed about this through entering a state of holochi, which is actually to create a state of fasting, which literally translates to creating love during this time. And they decided that we would move. So we pulled our ancestors' bones from our mounds, we carried them with us, and traveled many moons until we reached the place that we could go into the other world, which is the land we reside upon today. However, we forgot our sacred medicine, the corn, which is the basis of our ceremonies and our healing. And luckily, those little shoshi there, those ants, carried it along the way without us noticing. However, when we got to the site of transitioning into this world, the Choctaws became pushy and began stepping on the little shoshi. And our great spirit decided that that was enough after we started pushing a little bit too much, and an elder fell and a child fell, and decided the next Choctaw to push and be pushy would become a shoshi themselves. And so the line got very short and the Choctaws got through to the new world. As a researcher and as a clinical health psychologist, I like to create space for our stories. I actually like to go typically more in depth with our stories and give a little more background, but more because stories are really important. They embed our ways of thinking, our views of the world, and I find a lot of our views of health. So as I tell my own children our Choctaw stories, as I've been told them, we find there's lots of instructions for ways of being through that. For instance, our ancestors have instructions for health is often in our stories, our interrelationship with nature, our mutual respect with our medicines that are gifts. So if we are ill, it's due to our imbalance within these relationships. So as we step on the ants, we became the ants. We neglected that relationship with the ants, and we now have a relationship and obligation to them. If we take too much of our sacred medicines, such as food, we can become obese and it can come back and harm us. Choctaws also have stories of tobacco is very sacred. It's very sacred to us. And if we misuse that tobacco and abuse it on a daily basis, it too can come back to harm us. So there's all kinds of teachings embedded within those stories, as well as the importance of space, place, and community for healing. With the Western medicine framework, being a clinical health psychologist, I'm often trained to ask patients about what kind of diseases and curses your ancestors have given you. So when you walk into an exam room, they say, do you have diabetes? Do any of your ancestors have cancer? What else have they done to you? Whereas from our Indigenous viewpoint, we look at what our ancestors have gifted us. And I think that's a stark contrast that arises often when I work with communities around research and how we approach health and well-being, which we know as most Indigenous people voice that, health surpasses just the body or the physical. It's about the mental. It's about our relationships with the earth. It's our relationships with the animals that we're around, and our relationships with the waters and the sky as well. Now, no surprise, a lot of Indigenous people are still dealing with effects of trauma. As we know, it's been a severe disruption. A lot of times people ask, well, what is trauma exactly? And it's just really that disruption to the mental, physical, social, emotional, spiritual well-being. It's interesting because in the United States, the government has picked up some of the lingo, I believe, as influence from our Indigenous communities about how trauma has affected communities and how that's influenced them today. We know, sorry, I'm just going to get this to go. We know that colonial historical trauma has also created vast woundings across Indigenous communities. More than not, though, it's also disrupted our connection to our Mother Earth, to our ceremonies, to our wise practices that have kept us healthy. And through this disruption, we've seen chronic diseases rise. We've seen health disparities also increase. At the same time, as an Indigenous researcher, I like to give credit to my ancestors who were researchers for thousands of years. I wish I had more time to discuss, but there's all kinds of stories that we have and teachings that relate to how we can be healthy today, and that a lot of our community members do to maintain their health. We also know that communities have the stories, they have the foundational knowledge, they have instructions to become healthy again in areas that they may be lacking at the moment. We also know that health is more encompassing. So as I go through my work in particular, we know that original instructions in relationship to research have been disrupted. I've worked with my communities in looking at trauma and how trauma compounds over time and how it relates to chronic diseases. But we also have looked at how interpersonal relationships, restoring those relationships to medicine, can be very beneficial and reduce the risk of chronic diseases, food addiction, and substance use addiction. And really that comes from transforming the narratives around trauma into ones of healing, or calling upon the ancestors' love and practices to reclaim health. And as Indigenous researchers and as researchers in general, we look at indigenizing, which is building up from our Indigenous knowledges while at the same time decolonizing. But all in all, Indigenous communities must be in control. We know that the approach is to recognize data in all forms as a representation of living beings, to know that the community needs to be directing the data, directing the research. And I've done some of this work with my own community. I apologize, I don't have time to really go through it, but we've rewalked our Trail of Tears to reconnect with our ancestors. And I've been working with other Indigenous communities to reconnect with their ancestral routes of trauma, not to relive the trauma, but to reclaim the power and the resilience that was there on the land during that time, and the instructions how to maintain their health and well-being for the future generations. And a lot of that has to do around the ancestors, learning what kind of ancestor you want to be in the future, working with youth around what kind of ancestor they want to become in the future, and how they can make that happen. I'm just going to briefly go through some of these slides. And again, I can talk with anyone else who's interested later on through email or other communications about this. But it's really about relational restoration cultural continuity is extremely important for health and well-being within Indigenous communities. And as researchers, we really need to provide the space, right? There's a lot of complexity within helping. And instead of, helping someone as opposed to I'm going to come in and help this community, to just creating space for them to heal themselves, because they have their own songs. Communities have their own stories. They have their own teachings to be healthy today. And as researchers, we need to honor that and create the space for that to occur. And we can do that through utilizing the Indigenous methodologies, through recognizing that knowledge comes from other sources than just empirical knowledge. There's traditional knowledge, revealed knowledge, and contemporary knowledge. And overall, just to be sure that we do research in a good way. And that when we enter into relationships in a good way, then we can actually provide usefulness to the community. And with that, I will stop. Thank you very much.
Great. Thanks, Michelle. Really appreciate the drawing in of stories and our traditional ways of knowing and being, and helping us guide the work. And I think that's a parallel piece that I heard from Shadi and Jennifer's conversation too, about the power of communities being able to direct research. And I wonder, as a researcher, within an academic role, how have you created space for communities to be directing that research?
Well, I think that's a really important thing to do with communities. And I've worked with many of them on looking at their research protocols. So when I engage with community, first of all, we establish what does it mean to do research with them, and what are their protocols that they have for doing research in a good way. And with my own community, as well as with others, we develop those principles that are important to them. And then we engage through our relationship building and through the process of research through honoring those.
Great, thanks. So thank you to our presenters. I raise my hands, and thanks for sharing your knowledge and your teachings. And I now invite our audience members to ask some questions. You can put those in the group chat. We did have some folks submit questions ahead of time. So maybe to get the conversation started, I'll just randomly select a few of those. And then as the chat box comes in, we'll start asking questions from the audience who are participating right now live. So Francis asked, how do we share knowledge to grassroots, especially those who do not live close proximity to higher education institutions? And maybe Jennifer and Shadi can think about that.
Right. I think ultimately it's about going to those communities and sharing that knowledge. I think I remember when I was a grad student, so many times people from communities were invited to the campuses to speak, or elders were invited to campuses to present. But it was so rare. I don't remember living in my community. I just moved back to the city, and I was living there for maybe the last 2-3 years. I don't think there was ever a time that I can recall when a university or campus set up any kind of knowledge mobilization or information sharing event in the community, where they were saying, hey, look, we did this research here about your people. Here's what we found out. There was nothing ever that was like that, or we've done research with you, or what would you like research about? So I think it's really about getting out of the institution and going to the communities and making the effort to have that dialogue and conversation with those communities. Now that's for communities where they're not close or in proximity to higher education institutions, but from the NAFC's perspective, we know that there's so many Indigenous communities in every urban center, and the majority of Indigenous peoples live in urban centers. So there really is no excuse. Every higher education institution is located in proximity to an Indigenous community. So whether that's reaching out to the friendship centers or any other urban Indigenous community organization, is to include them in your research, kind of in a similar way that we're doing with the UAKN, through the friendship centers as a kind of center, community center to reach out to that community. So yeah.
And we actually have a really good example of something happening in the Grand Prairie region in Alberta. There's actually a friendship center in the university. So we're seeing that actually makes a huge difference in building relationships and the research that happens. And I think an ultimate goal would to have more universities kind of have friendship center programming, or even to have friendship centers within their universities.
I think there's a good example to it. UVic, when I was there, the friendship center had a library in the Friendship Center building, but they had like a partnership with the university where we could go to the Friendship Center to take out certain, they had like a really good collection of Indigenous books at that library at the Friendship Center. So as students, we could go to the Friendship Center and take out books and do reading and studying there, which was a cool partnership because it brought students to the centers themselves, you know, where otherwise I might not have gone to the Friendship Center.
Right. So I hear the importance of sustained relationships, of engaging with community and not assuming who the community is or where they're not. And also thinking about, you know, the sustained ethics of reciprocity. What does it mean to be giving back as researchers, whether we're community researchers or academic researchers? And the divide is not always that clear, right? There's a lot of us who are community-based and we do research, and so that piece of it. Michelle, a question for you from Leora. When dealing with applied learning and community-based projects and research, how do we address the cultural divides and differences in cultural perspectives, and bridging gaps in thinking about, I think the question is focusing on mainstream Canadians when relating to Indigenous peoples, but I even think there's a question in there about how do we as Indigenous peoples who come from different tribal nations, different geographic teachings, we have different stories, how do we also relate in that conversation?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I've worked with many Indigenous communities that are culturally different than my own, and actually have the honor of being married to someone who's from multiple different tribal backgrounds than my own. So we often work through these issues of our differences in culture and how to honor that. I think especially when I'm working with Indigenous communities, I am upfront with my cultural background. I explain to them where I'm coming from and try to remain very aware of that and honor their wishes and how they want to move forward. I worked with Maori communities as well who had different of opinions of how you address food or eating in your life, and just being aware of that and providing space for them to discuss that and really direct the research in that area is critical. We also have differences in how we have to apply for grant applications. That comes up quite a bit. We have, for instance, dream knowledge or visions that may come in that the community is very interested in, but as researchers, we talk with them about, do we want to include that in the grant or do we want to look at it from this perspective? And I often draw from motivational interviewing because it resonates with a lot of Indigenous ways of behaving teaching. So again, I think just providing space for them to have the guidance and control over it is what we do first and foremost.
Yeah, and for our settler allies, I think it's also about them doing their homework before coming in to these relationships, right? Seeking out the resources that are available. You know, there's lots of scholarship, as Shady has pointed out, that's publicly available. It's not hidden behind these ivory tower walls. So doing your homework, I think, is equally important for all of us. So we have a question from the participants who are live and watching. And Elaine asks, getting consent and ensuring respect. How do you gain consent if you're accessing a national database?
Mm-hmm.
So Elaine, if you can type in what kind of national database and who owns the database, that might help us kind of guide the answer to the question. But any initial thoughts or reactions from our presenters?
I can just speak to having that experience of being in the US where we cannot write about a tribal nation without their permission, even if it is from a national database. Mm-hmm. So that's always been my perspective, that we, if I'm working on in a specific geographical area that affects the tribal communities in that area, I do go to their tribal council or another leader within the community and ask, where do I go from here? How do I gain permission from them or support? And then I also try to send them my manuscript before I publish that to make sure that they're aware of what I'm stating and is okay. If they want their name used or not, if they want the geographical location coded, then I do that as well.
Great. And I think she just responded, she's interested in how do we appropriately access things like our long form Canadian Stats census, which is, it's controlled, I guess, essentially by Stats Canada. So any suggestions on how we work with these national database organizations to Jennifer?
Well, I can't speak exactly to like the long form, but mm-hmm. I do know that I think we do work closely with StatsCan, so we have the relationship there. I think if we ever pulled information, it would be anonymous anyways. Like we wouldn't actually be able to have any names or profiles of who we would be speaking about. Within NAFC, we do have a national database that we collect all of our Friendship Center programs and services and different stats about buildings and client populations. The thing that we do with that is we do kind of use this model of ongoing consent. So maybe if someone said yes last year that we could share something, we're always constantly checking in. So we kind of look at consent as not something that's very static. It's something that's always changing of how we're going to use it and who we're asking and what kind of product. So if we're going to create a report or a product or like a fact sheet, we make sure to share it and make the community members that we're going to be speaking about a part of the process.
And I think it's a little trickier from an urban context too in terms of getting consent, because you're not specifically doing it on a specific community or nation. So there's not really a community representative per se, or a political representative or a nation representative when you're doing research on an urban Indigenous community or an urban issue. It could be a little more trickier in terms of how to navigate that space, I think.
Yeah,
I think that's where a lot of the strength of the Friendship Centers comes into play, where we want to be those places where we could kind of gather the urban population and put kind of these plans in place and support them with the research framework and the screening tools and build that capacity.
Yeah, and I think even in my own research and working with Indigenous university and college students, you know, the REBs that we do at an institutional level contain, you know, we do chapter 9 and all those things, but then there's also the relationship building that needs to happen within those contexts. So even, you know, the urban community going to every single nation that's represented is I think a challenge, but it's also important to know who within those urban contexts you should be speaking to and thinking about. So in my context, I always speak to the elders on campus or the Indigenous Student Center, which tends to be the hub. I seek out if they do have an Indigenous research advisory group. You know, those formal structures within our institutions too can also be important for us to have those relationships with. So there are these larger relationship buildings and responsibilities to doing work within our communities and thinking of our communities broadly. So. Great. So we don't have any burning questions from the groups participating, so I'll go back to our pre-submitted questions. So thinking about how do we ensure community engaged pedagogy and research is sustainable within the academy, and I would extend that to how is it sustainable within our communities?
Okay, so I'll speak a little bit to just building on to what we've said. To make it more sustainable, I think first and foremost should be making sure it's sustainable within the communities, because a lot of the time the academy is going in and taking information from the community and publishing and kind of making sure, back to that reciprocal relationship, that there has to be a mutual benefit. And I think when there's that mutual benefit, it will be sustainable. Those relationships will continue. We've seen that with a lot of the UACN research centers. They all have directors working out of the different universities, working closely with the friendship centers. If one of the directors retires, there's going to be someone else that goes into their place and continues that relationship.
Yeah, that sustainability of and mentoring the next generation, I think, is a really a key
Sorry
point.
if it's a little loud. They're blowing the leaves outside of our boardroom.
That's okay. You can't control that background noise. So maybe you can just mute yourself while in between answering questions. Okay, Michelle, I have one for you. This is from John. And so in their programming has a strong emphasis on holistic well-being. And some of the challenges with more direct health-related programming is balancing and navigating between mainstream and Indigenous approaches, including traditional foods and medicines, which you've already spoken about in your work. So can you speak about the evaluation approaches that support capturing the benefits of holistic approaches to research and holistic programming, especially within the health realm,
Yes.
which I
Yes.
think is also translatable to education, just saying. But
Yes, I think so. And anytime you have government type funding or external funding, you are beholden to certain outcomes that you have to reach. And sometimes those do or do not overlap with the community and what they're trying to accomplish. So for instance, with my own community, we employed different evaluation outcomes that one is digital stories. So we did digital storytelling with our participants, in which they record how the health intervention has influenced them, and then and how that relates to their life. And then we do a community screening, movie screening, so the whole community comes out and watches this. And then we also give them grant funding, so a little bit amount of money, so it's like $500 to do a community project at the end. So we're looking to build more health promotion activities within the community. They take that money and then utilize it to do other activities, such as they have a run club now in one community where no one was ever running on the streets before in the mountains. They have container gardens in another community, and they've done their own series of lectures and seminars around what historical trauma is and how that affects the community in another area, for instance. And so those are different outcomes than what we're measuring via the grant. The grant, we're measuring biometric outcomes, we're measuring mental health measures, we're also measuring, of course, propensity for addiction or not, or if that's lowered or not. So we submit those separately. So we actually don't submit what the community does and their outcomes in a grant modality. So in a progress report, for instance, that's not done. So we just allow for that different space. Now we still are beholden to the community. So whatever outcomes occur, the community wants to know, and we have to give them different lectures and presentations on what's happening and what the outcomes have been from the community perspective. And we also give them what outcomes we have from the grants perspective as well. So we try to balance it and keeping the community apprised at all times, and continually drawing from, we have both an Indigenous Scientific Advisory Council, which we have those Indigenous researchers who are guiding the research, but we also have a Community Advisory Council in which the community members who live within the community every day are also giving us advice and counsel, and we're getting feedback from them about what we need to do differently. So long story short, basically we just employ a lot of different evaluation methods, qualitative and quantitative as well.
Okay, great. I have another question from Michael, and I think Shadi and Jennifer, you can answer this one. Thinking about how does one overcome research fatigue in communities? Even when the project protocol has mindfully engaged the community and received inputs in its research process, how do we make sure that we're also being ethical in our relationships, and how many times we're asking communities to keep answering questions and participating in projects?
It's a tough question.
Yeah,
I know, but it's a good one.
Not like I'm saying the same thing over and over again, but even what we've seen at the UAKN, and even kind of just what our last presenter was speaking about, is making sure that we're giving something back than just a report that's going to sit on a shelf. So with the UAKN, a lot of the things that come out of the research project have been videos. We do have lots of films as well, like short films and longer ones, different kind of tools and resources, photo projects. So like kind of changing what we use for knowledge mobilization. So we're actually giving something back to the community that they can use. And what we've even seen with friendship centers engaging in research is they're taking the outcomes and the tools that we've used and using that to write proposals for additional funding for actual programs and services. So you're actually seeing like a direct impact. And we've seen that even through one of our projects that was focused on early childhood education and also even like child welfare. The projects that are happening in the UAKN are actually creating change within their communities and supporting a lot of the projects, and even allowing them to have additional funding to support their communities. So making sure that we're actually doing something than just a report on a shelf.
And I think if the research itself is actually community driven, then there really shouldn't be a whole lot of research fatigue, right? Like we shouldn't be asking the same questions if the community is deciding what those questions are, and if they're taking the lead and if they're taking ownership of the work. I think a lot of times community-driven research might be identified as that when it isn't necessarily community-driven research. There might be a community partner or stakeholder, but they're not actually developing the questions or creating what the research is. So I think if the communities themselves are creating the research, are identifying what their needs are, they're the ones asking the questions and are directing it, then I think that at that point there shouldn't be a whole lot of research for taking. That being said, a community who is consistently identified as the community that should be researched, there might be examples of that out there, but I could see how that might be fatiguing for that community also, where they might still be driving the research, but for some reason, all the research dollars are going to that community. That might become exhausting as well. So,
Yeah, for sure. So we have 5 minutes left. So I want to ask one more question, and it's probably the crux of another webinar, I think. But thinking about any advice on how to negotiate, navigate when community protocols and ethics are in conflict with academic ethic board protocols. So I currently have a project that's looking at that kind of work. I cannot yet say what that findings are, but stay tuned, and I can certainly share information with Nicole on that project about how do we navigate Indigenous cultural ethics within our RAB experiences, being within institutions and communities. So, but any thoughts, Michelle, on how to navigate communities with protocols first and then our RABs?
Yes, yes. Well, I come from the training and background that community protocol is most important, of course, when you're working with a community. And so I've actually had good experience in going back to the academic ethic board and letting them know what the community has stated, explaining to them more thoroughly about why the community needs something done in this manner. It's been simple things such as gift cards or, listing someone's social insurance number before you give them a certain amount, and identifying information. And all in all, I've had really great experiences. But I think really being a strong advocate for your community is most important. And I think most academic review boards are there to help support the community's needs and can be open to that. I'm interested in your study though, Michelle, to see what you find.
Yeah, me too. Okay, well, I think given the time, I'm going to thank our presenters so much for contributing to the conversation. The chat board has been quite active and listening, and people can't write notes fast enough. So I remind everyone that the webinar has been recorded, that Nicole will be sending out the contact information for the presenters and also the handouts and things like that next week once the recording is processed and available. And I just want to thank everyone for participating. And you can also, I'll encourage you all to sign up for the Community Campus Engage Canada's mailing list, a link which will be circulated with the webinar video next week to stay up to date on future webinars and suggestions. And I encourage you, if you do have follow-up questions for any of the presenters, please feel free. They're more than open to having emails and phone conversations and further dialogue with you all. So thanks again for attending and have a great day.